I never thought my quiet retirement as governor would spiral into a battle with my HOA president over my home of 50 years. But when she destroyed my late wife's memorial bench and attempted to bulldoze my rose garden in the dead of night, it made me wonder, what would happen if she realized she picked a fight with the wrong person? It's a strange journey, and I'd like to share it with you. The loud banging on my front door at 7 a.m. was enough to jolt me awake. After a late budget meeting the night before, I wasn't exactly eager to deal with interruptions on my Sunday morning. When I opened the door, there stood Barbara Wilson, our new HOA president. With her foot tapping and a familiar look of disapproval, she wasted no time. "Governor Williams, your roses are 3 inches taller than regulation height," she declared, waving her measuring tape as if it were a badge of honor. "This is your 4th violation this month." I looked past her to my wife Sarah's cherished rose garden, the one promise I'd made to keep alive after cancer took her last year. For 49 years, she tended to those roses every morning while I enjoyed my coffee on the porch. Now, they were suddenly a problem. "Barbara," I replied calmly, "those roses have been here since 1920. The HOA didn't even exist until 1990. She adjusted her designer sunglasses and shoved a sheet of paper into my hands. "New bylaws were passed last month. You should attend the meetings if you want a say in things. Being governor doesn't make you special here." I held back my urge to mention that I missed the meeting due to a state emergency. Instead, I watched as she marched across my lawn, still clutching her measuring tape, ready to give Tom Patterson a hard time over his mailbox color. Later that afternoon, while sorting through my mail, I came across something unsettling. A letter addressed to "current resident" instead of my name. Inside was an eviction notice stating that I had 30 days to vacate the property. My hands began to shake. This had to be a mistake. I called Tom immediately. He's been my neighbor for 30 years and was on the original HOA board. "Hey, did you get any strange mail today?" I asked. "Thank goodness you called," Tom replied urgently. "I just saw your house listed for sale on Zillow. It was posted this morning." My stomach sank. "That's impossible. I own this house outright." "Well, someone thinks differently. The listing agent is Wilson Real Estate Group, Barbara Wilson." It was all coming together. I was caught off guard by the eviction notice and the new bylaws that our neighborhood association had suddenly imposed. It felt clear to me that this wasn't really about garden regulations. I spent the next hour sorting through my home office, trying to locate the original deed to our property. Finally, tucked away in Sarah's old filing system, I found the document. To my surprise, another paper slid out, a handwritten letter from her that I had never seen before. "If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists." "My dearest John," it started, "if you're reading this, something's gone wrong with the house. Check the bottom of my rose garden, 3rd bush from the left. I buried copies of all our important papers there in a waterproof box. You always teased me about being too careful with documents, but I had a feeling we'd need them someday." Even after she was gone, Sarah was still looking out for our home. With a shovel in hand and still clad in my suit from yesterday's meetings, I made my way to the garden. As I began digging beneath her beloved peace rose, I could hear Barbara from next door. "Of course it's legal," she was saying into her phone. "The digital transition mixed up some ownership records, and we're just correcting them. By the time anyone figures it out, the sale will be final." She chuckled, remarking that even the governor couldn't challenge City Hall. Suddenly, my shovel struck something hard. I unearthed a metal box containing everything we needed: our original deed, property surveys, and every document we had ever signed, including one from 1990 that specifically protected our long-standing garden. Looking up, I noticed Barbara watching me from across the fence. Her voice faded as the confident facade she wore slipped when she saw the box in my hands. In an instant, she turned and hurried back to her house, already dialing another number. As the sun set behind my home of 50 years, casting long shadows through Sarah's roses, it hit me. This was about more than just keeping our house. How many other properties had Barbara adjusted during this digital transition? And didn't she realize that a governor might have a few insights into investigating fraud? I grabbed my phone and called James Martinez, our state attorney. James, remember how you mentioned wanting a solid case against real estate fraud? Well, I think I've stumbled onto something interesting right here in my own backyard. I could hear Barbara again, frantically shouting into her phone about emergency HOA meetings and shredding documents. But for the first time all day, I felt a smile spread across my face. Sarah had always believed in our little Victorian house and its potential. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe she had a point. After finding that eviction notice, sleep eluded me, so I headed down to my basement where I keep all of my important papers. My hands trembled as I pulled out the old metal box that Sarah and I had bought when we first moved in. Inside was the original deed to our home from 1974. The paper had yellowed with age, but it was still easy to read. Beside it lay 50 years' worth of property tax receipts, each one carefully filed away by Sarah, who always had a knack for organization. Then, a sound made me look up through the basement window. A shiny real estate agent's car had just parked in front of my house. I saw my neighbor, Tom Patterson, jogging across his yard in his pajamas, trying to wave them off. Without thinking, I dashed upstairs and opened my front door just as I heard the agent mention an open house scheduled for this weekend. Confused, I called out, "There must be some mistake. I never listed my home for sale." She looked at me quizzically and pulled out her tablet. "According to county records, this property was just listed by the Valley Creek HOA," she said, turning the screen toward me. My heart raced as I saw my home listed for $850,000, accompanied by pictures I had never seen before. Eager to get to the bottom of this, I called my old friend James at the county records office. While waiting for him to check, I rummaged through more papers. That's when I stumbled upon something unusual, a notice from 6 months ago about the HOA modernizing its records. Barbara, the HOA president, had made a big fuss about going paperless, claiming it would make things simpler, but I hadn't given it much thought amidst a state budget crisis. Tom arrived with his laptop, as he was always better with technology than I was. Together, we explored the HOA's new online system. My stomach sank when we found my property record. It showed that I had transferred my deed to the HOA during this digital transition, but I knew I had never signed anything like that. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to the screen. He found 5 other homes in our neighborhood with similar transfers, all belonging to longtime residents who'd received complaints from Barbara about their yards or paint colors over the past year. Just then, James called back. "Governor," he said, his voice tense, "something's not right here. The digital deed shows a signature date from 3 months ago, but according to my records, I'm watching a video from the day I gave a speech in the Capitol. My security team had called earlier to tell me they spotted someone taking pictures of my house. When they questioned the person, he claimed he was measuring for some renovation work ordered by the Homeowners Association. The thing is, I hadn't approved any renovations. As I was writing all of this down, I received an email from Barbara. She reminded me that the HOA has full authority to uphold community standards. She mentioned that the young couple looking to buy this weekend seemed lovely and appreciated proper lawn care, unlike some current residents. As I read her message, pieces started to come together in a way I didn't like. Barbara's real estate firm was handling all the properties transferred through the HOA. Suddenly, there were complaints about longtime residents, and there was this strange digital transition happening. My years in politics had taught me to recognize a scheme when I saw one, and this certainly had the markings of something planned. Through my window, I noticed more cars pulling up outside. As the sky darkened, I could see Barbara directing people with clipboards towards my porch. She looked up, caught my eye, and gave me that same smirk she wore at last week's HOA meeting when she complained about my rose bushes. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from Linda Thompson, the HOA secretary. "Governor, please check your email. There's something important about the records transfer, but keep it between us." When I walked into the emergency HOA meeting, the room was packed with anxious neighbors. I hadn't worn my usual suit and tie. Instead, I showed up in my gardening clothes, dirt still on my knees from checking on Sarah's roses one last time. Barbara's expression turned red when she saw me dressed so casually. She had never liked that I continued gardening even after becoming governor. I took a seat in the front row, placing my old leather briefcase on the floor. Inside were all the documents proving I've owned my home since 1973. My neighbor Tom sat beside me, giving my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. The room was filled with whispers. It wasn't common for an emergency meeting to be called so unexpectedly. Barbara stood at the podium in her flashy red blazer, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against the wood. "Governor Williams," she said, her tone dripping with disdain as if my title were something unpleasant. "I assume you're here to discuss the property situation." She flashed that insincere smile I recognized from previous complaints about my garden hose being visible from the street. "You could say that," I replied. I kept my voice steady, just like Sarah taught me during my first campaign. I was there because Barbara was trying to sell my home without my permission. The room fell silent. You could almost hear the hum of the air conditioning. Barbara's smile grew, but it felt more threatening. She pulled out a thick stack of papers from her designer bag and began, "According to our new digital record system, you haven't owned that property since last year's update." I stood up slowly, feeling my knees creak a bit. "Barbara, I've lived in that house for 50 years. I have every document since 1973 right here," I said, patting my briefcase. "You can't just type something into a computer and claim my home as yours to sell." "Oh, but I can," she countered, waving her papers. "When we updated our systems, we found several irregularities. Your property wasn't registered under the new HOA guidelines, so ownership has defaulted to the association." I could see the neighbors stirring. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street stood up, clearly upset. "That's ridiculous. John's lived there longer than anyone." Barbara struck her gavel. "The rules are the rules. If you don't register your property properly during a system update, you forfeit your rights. It's all in Section 47B of the new bylaws." That's when I smiled, reaching into my briefcase. "Interesting you mentioned those new bylaws, Barbara. I have the original HOA agreement from 1980, which states that any changes to registration requirements must be approved by a 75% vote of homeowners." I pulled out another document. "And here's the proof from county records. No such vote ever happened." Barbara's face went pale as she rifled through her papers faster. "That's not relevant. The digital transition supersedes the law," she argued, but then a familiar voice from the back interrupted. James Martinez, my old friend and state attorney, stood up. "I'd be very interested in hearing how a database can override 50 years of legal property records." Barbara's hand started to shake. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared, grabbing her papers. In her haste, one slipped from her grasp, and Tom picked it up before she could reclaim it. "Hey, this is a sale contract dated 3 months ago," he exclaimed, shock evident in his voice. "You've been trying to sell John's house since January?" The room erupted with noise as Barbara backed away from the podium, neighbors shouting questions amid the chaos. I watched as she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. Later, we would find out she was deleting emails. I didn't realize the extent of the backups Linda had saved regarding Barbara until I spoke up. My voice broke through the chatter in the room. "I just signed an executive order this morning to create a state task force focused on housing fraud. Want to guess who's leading it?" Before I could finish, she dashed for the door, her high heels clicking against the tile. But James was quicker, and 2 police officers were already waiting in the lobby. I noticed her designer bag tumble to the floor, spilling papers that hinted at a deeper issue than we anticipated. Tom picked up the gavel Barbara had left behind, and I proposed an immediate vote to remove her from her position as HOA president. In a swift show of hands, everyone in the room raised theirs in agreement. Yet I sensed this was merely the start of something larger. Later, I sat in my study, staring at the walls that held the evidence we had collected against Barbara. Something felt off. The paper trail was unusually convoluted for someone as meticulous as her. Just then, Linda Thompson, our HOA secretary for the past 15 years, knocked softly on my door. With tears in her eyes and a USB drive in her trembling hands, she said, "Governor Williams, I can't sleep at night anymore." She closed the door quietly behind her. "Barbara didn't just target your home. There's so much more to this." Before I connected the USB drive to my computer, my security team quickly scanned it. What we discovered sent a chill down my spine. It contained spreadsheets, property records, and forged documents, all organized carefully by date and neighborhood. Barbara had gone beyond altering my records. She had been systematically seizing homes across the county. I called Tom Patterson, who lived next door to 3 vacant houses recently acquired by Barbara's company. He came over right away, bringing his daughter Sarah, a data analyst who had been questioning the property records for some time. "Look at this pattern," Sarah said, directing our attention to her laptop screen. "Every property on this list is either owned by elderly residents, busy professionals who might overlook changes, or people living out of state. Barbara's company claims there are HOA violations and then uncovers ownership issues." Linda hovered as she pulled up more files. "I started keeping records when she joined the board 5 years ago. At first, it was just odd things. Changes to meeting minutes, missing complaint forms from certain homeowners. Then I noticed property documents vanishing from our files." Tom paced my study, his frustration palpable. "Remember the Andersons? They lived here for 40 years. Barbara mentioned that they chose to sell their house due to HOA violations. They had moved to Florida last year. I felt a wave of sadness and reached for my phone, but Linda caught my arm. "Wait, there's more," she said. It turned out Barbara had a whole network of real estate agents, contractors, and even a contact at the county records office. They were all involved. Then Sarah pulled up another document that made my heart race. It was a list of future targets, 30 more homes in our neighborhood. Next to each address were notes detailing the owner's vulnerabilities. For my home, it noted, "Too busy with state duties to notice changes. Wife deceased. Emotional attachment to property makes thorough legal review unlikely." They had been observing us, identifying our weaknesses, and using this information against us. I remembered my rose garden, the one Sarah had helped me plant when we first moved in. Barbara hadn't targeted it just because it broke HOA rules. She knew it would serve as a distraction, keeping me busy with grief and anger while she plotted to take my home. Linda showed us emails that outlined Barbara's next steps. She planned to present evidence at next week's HOA meeting, claiming that several residents had failed to transfer their deeds correctly during the digital transition. To an outsider, it would appear to be a simple clerical error needing correction. However, Sarah pointed out, I checked the original county records. None of these ownership changes actually went through the proper channels. Barbara had been fabricating documents that looked legitimate but weren't registered. She was relying on people not verifying the county records. As we dug deeper, Tom noticed a strange pattern with the dates. Every attempt to take over a property coincided with major state events when people would be too preoccupied to notice local issues. I leaned back in my chair, finally comprehending the full extent of Barbara's scheme. She wasn't just stealing homes. She was constructing an empire right under our noses, exploiting our trust in the HOA system. The concern had shifted from saving my home to stopping her before she could ruin our whole community. Linda straightened up, her fear transforming into anger. "I have copies of everything, Governor. Every email, every fake document, every recording of secret meetings. I've kept them for years, waiting for someone strong enough to bring her down." I looked around at the determined faces, Linda's fierce resolve, Tom's justifiable outrage, and Sarah's focused analysis. We had the truth and a strong community behind us, even if we were outmatched in money and connections. Barbara was about to find out that interfering with people's homes could be very risky, especially since one of those people held the authority of the governor's office. As Sarah's laptop pinged with a new alert, we quickly learned that Barbara had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for the following night. We exchanged knowing glances. It felt like the moment had arrived. Our time for gathering evidence was up. Now we faced a choice. Should we set our plan in motion, or was Barbara ready to roll out hers? I was just settling in for the night when my phone buzzed. It was Tom, his voice trembling as he said, "They're here with bulldozers." I dashed to my window and saw the yellow machines creeping up the street like giant shadows in the night. My security team was already on high alert, their flashlights slicing through the darkness as they surrounded 3 workers in construction gear. One of them brandished a document that looked official, claiming the HOA president had given them the go-ahead. But I had experience with official papers from my years as governor, and I could tell this one was a forgery. My hands trembled as I called the police, but I managed to keep my voice steady, a skill I had honed during many state emergencies. While I waited, I opened my laptop and began live streaming the situation from my security cameras. If Barbara wanted to play dirty, she'd have to do it with the eyes of the internet upon her. The police arrived in minutes, sirens silent but lights flashing. Officer Rodriguez, who'd grown up in this neighborhood, took one look at the paperwork and shook his head with a hint of a smile. "This authorization is dated for next week," he said, clearly amused. It seemed Barbara hadn't even bothered to check the dates on her forged document. I thought that would be the turning point, but I was mistaken. The next morning, as my security detail switched shifts, something caught my attention through the kitchen window. There was Barbara, standing by Sarah's memorial bench, phone in hand, deep in conversation. Before I could reach her, she disappeared, but what she left behind was more shattering than any bulldozer. Sarah's beautiful bench, where she used to share stories with our grandkids, lay in ruins. The bronze plaque with her name was gone, and our favorite quote about love and roses was scratched out. 50 years of memories lay broken like the scattered marble shards across my lawn. I heard the back door slam. Tom was already rushing over, phone out and recording. Linda from across the street came rushing over, tears in her eyes as she took in the devastation. "I got it all on my security camera," she said, pulling up the footage on her phone. "Barbara did this herself, not even an hour ago." But then, Linda gasped. Zooming in on her screen, she pointed out something in the background that caught my attention. Behind Barbara's shoulder was a familiar figure, the same developer who had been trying to buy up our whole block for years. They both were looking at papers, pointing at different houses on our street. My security team had unearthed 3 more hidden cameras around my property, all connected to an unknown IP address. It turned out Barbara hadn't just been bothering me. She had been studying my routine, learning when my house was least secure. Sitting in my garden amongst the shards of Sarah's old bench, I felt a shift within me. Unknown to Barbara, however, was the hidden camera inside Sarah's birdhouse, which I hadn't been able to remove out of sentimentality. Plus, my security team had discreetly placed a GPS tracker on her car after the initial threats began. I also found out her phone had been automatically connecting to my guest Wi-Fi, logging every visit she made. As I picked up pieces of marble, my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors sharing their own security footage. Barbara had been busy the night before, putting condemned notices on every house owned by anyone over 60. But she'd made a big mistake. The notices bore the official state seal, my seal. Looking at the broken remnants of Sarah's bench, I recalled her saying that everything happens for a reason. Perhaps she was right. Barbara thought she was destroying evidence, but instead, she had handed me exactly what I needed to stop her, proof that she was impersonating state officials. That evening, as I watched the sunset cast a golden hue on my roses, my phone buzzed again with an alert from my security system. Barbara had returned, this time with a whole team dressed in suits. But upon seeing the state police cars parked quietly along the street, her expression changed. She finally grasped the gravity of her actions. She hadn't just picked a fight with an old man who cherished his garden. She had declared war on a governor who knew how to fight back. The morning began with sirens, not the usual faint sounds from my security detail, but loud ones that suggested serious business. I was enjoying my morning coffee when 3 state police cars rolled up to Barbara's house. My neighbor Tom, still in his bathrobe, hurried over to see what was happening. He spilled his coffee as he excitedly showed me a message from Linda. On his phone were the HOA's financial records, clearly outlining suspicious transfers to offshore accounts. It turned out Barbara wasn't just stealing homes, she was leading a criminal operation. From my porch, I noticed Barbara stepping out in her designer pajamas and that pearl necklace she was always bragging about. She still held her head high, acting like she owned the entire neighborhood. Officers stood around her, reading her rights, while she stood there, hands cuffed behind her back, her perfectly styled hair getting tousled by the morning breeze. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice echoing down the street. "Do you know who I am? I'm friends with Senator Parker." I couldn't help but chuckle. After all, Parker had lost his seat last year due to his own scandal. As curiosity drew neighbors out of their homes, some in bathrobes and others dressed for work, Mrs. Johnson from number 42 appeared, filming the scene with shaking hands. Just a month ago, Barbara had threatened her with fines for having a wheelchair ramp that she deemed an eyesore. Agent Rodriguez approached me, ready to share his findings. He explained that this case involved 3 counties, 17 neighborhoods, and over 40 homes, all following a similar pattern. Digital records altered, eviction notices served suddenly, quick sales to Barbara's real estate company, and substantial profits made from flipping these properties. Handing me a thick folder, he stated, "Your home wasn't the first, but it will be the last. We've uncovered evidence spanning 5 years, and some victims have lost everything." Shortly after, a news van from Channel 5 pulled up, soon followed by another from Channel 9. Spotting the cameras, Barbara changed her approach. "Governor Williams orchestrated this whole thing," she screamed, mascara running down her cheeks. "He's trying to discredit me before the election. Ask him about the bribes." Remaining calm on my porch, I sipped my coffee as the reporter's eyes shifted between me and Barbara being led to the police car. They could see the truth for themselves. My 2 decades in public service had taught me one important lesson: the truth always finds a way to surface. Just then, Linda arrived, carrying boxes filled with documents. Though she looked tired, there was pride in her demeanor. "I've been gathering evidence for months," she told the officers. "Every fake document, every altered record, every illegal sale." Barbara thought she could go unnoticed because she targeted older residents who might not check their files. More police cars arrived, all heading to Barbara's real estate office downtown. Tom squeezed my shoulder and quietly said, "Sarah would be proud. Remember how she always said your stubbornness would save the day someday?" The investigation was gaining momentum. By noon, we discovered that Barbara's company was linked to similar schemes in 2 other states, and the FBI was stepping in. My phone was buzzing with calls from various governors, senators, and even the Attorney General. Just before the police car door closed, Barbara's last words focused on my upcoming re-election campaign. She believed this was all about politics. What she didn't understand was that some things hold more weight than power, like home, community, and doing what's right. I glanced at my rose garden and Sarah's broken memorial bench at our home of 50 years. A young reporter approached, microphone ready, eager to ask about my campaign plans. I smiled, thinking about the retirement papers still waiting on my desk in the Capitol. Barbara assumed I was simply fighting to maintain my position as governor. However, as I watched her being driven away, it became clear that this was never about retaining power. The real question was, how many others like Barbara were out there, preying on good people just trying to live peacefully in their homes? Tomorrow, I would make my major announcement at the Capitol, but today felt like the right time to tend to my roses and fix the memorial bench. As the morning sun warmed my face, I knelt in my rose garden, planting a new Sarah's Love rose bush. My hands weren't as steady as they once were, but planting each flower felt like a small victory. Tom Patterson, my neighbor of 30 years, walked over with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Never thought I'd see the day Barbara Wilson would end up behind bars," he remarked, handing me a cup. "The news is calling it the biggest real estate scam in state history." I smiled, reflecting on how all this began with a simple dispute over a rose garden. The media trucks had finally left my driveway yesterday after camping out for 3 straight weeks. People seem to love stories about corrupt HOA presidents trying to take the governor's house. Linda Thompson, our new HOA president, joined us, carrying a thick folder. She had been working hard to clean up the mess Barbara left behind. "You won't believe what we found in the old records," she said, sitting on Sarah's new memorial bench. Barbara tried the same scheme in 3 other places. Before moving here, she targeted older residents, manipulating property records during tech upgrades to force quick sales through her company. My security detail, Mike, approached me with his morning report. "Sir, we've identified 28 more victims across the state. The FBI is involved now," he said. After a brief pause, he added, "And Mrs. Wilson is trying to negotiate with the prosecutors." I shook my head, recalling Barbara's outraged face when they arrested her. She had shouted about conspiracy theories, claiming she would expose my administration. What she didn't grasp was that I had spent my entire career standing up to people like her, those who believed the rules didn't apply to them. As I stood there, neighborhood kids rode by on their bikes, waving at me. Little Annie, from 2 doors down, even stopped to hand me a card she had drawn. It was a colorful picture of my rose garden with the words "Our Hero" written in crayon. Just then, my phone buzzed with a new message from the state attorney general. They wanted me to testify at Barbara's trial next month. I considered declining, picturing myself enjoying my retirement in peace. But then I glanced at Sarah's bench, remembering how Barbara's goons had destroyed the original. I realized I couldn't walk away from this. Tom helped me up, my knees protesting with every movement. "You know what Sarah would say about all this," he remarked with a knowing smile. "She'd laugh herself silly," I replied, touching the smooth wood of her new bench. "Then she'd tell me to stop worrying and to plant more roses." Linda had spread out some papers on the bench. "Look at these new HOA bylaws we've drafted," she said. "We're ensuring full digital transparency, triple verification for property record changes, and mandatory resident voting on major decisions." She pointed to a specific section. "We're calling it the Williams Rule." I felt tears welling up, but blinked them away. Sarah always said that crying was just the heart's way of watering hope. Right now, hope was blooming all over our neighborhood. Families who had lost their homes to Barbara's schemes were moving back in, and the community began to heal. As the morning went on, more neighbors stopped by to share their stories, how they had felt bullied by Barbara and helpless against her tactics. But now they were telling tales of victory, of justice, and of a community coming together. My rose garden had become a symbol of resilience, standing up to corruption, one flower at a time. I looked at my home of 50 years, its Victorian charm untouched despite Barbara's best efforts. Sometimes the biggest challenges arise in the smallest of spaces, a garden, a park bench, or even our own homes. Standing my ground can make all the difference. As I watched the morning light dance on the roses alongside my neighbors, I understood that this struggle was about more than just preserving my home. It was about safeguarding the people and places we hold dear, and standing up to those who act as if they are above the rules. With that in mind, I picked up my gardening tools, ready to plant yet another rose bush. There were still many flowers to plant and a community to nurture.